So another way of thinking about resilience thinking is to think of it as systems thinking. And usually when we say we're going to manage natural resources, we focus on just that part of the system. And part of resilience thinking, or whole of system thinking, is that we also incorporate some of the other factors that influence how the system works. And the reason we do that is because a lot of the failure in the way natural resources or the environmental part of the system is managed is actually due to these other systems. So very often it's part of the economic system, or part of the institutional system, or part of the social system. But the problem when we do that, we incorporate all these different aspects of the system, is we get something that looks a little bit like this. And so you can see straight away why many natural resource management plans or policies do not address the whole of the system, because it just seems too complicated and they don't know how to do that. So one of the positive things about resilience thinking is that resilience has this unwritten law or rule that says there's lots of interrelationships between different parts of the system, but really what we need to understand is very few key critical relationships in that system, and usually that's less than the number of fingers on your hand. And so if we can reduce that complicated system here into something that's a little bit more manageable and understandable by pulling out just the critical relationships that we need to understand, then that's a great step forward in allowing us to incorporate real systems thinking into our planning and our implementation. So in terms of resilience thinking terminology, when you're reading about resilience, you'll come across this term called the Socio-Economic System. And that's a name given to this whole of system thinking. So we're including the environmental, we're including the social, we're including the economic part of the system. So we can start thinking about things like government, the structures of institutions, and these are the things that are commonly responsible for failures in natural resource management planning. So let's think about systems a little bit more. When you look at a system, it usually has a boundary of some sort, and it's always an artificial boundary, because a system always links and has relationships with other systems and outside influences. But to be able to manage a system, we need to look at and identify a system in itself. And when you look at a system like this, what you'll see is that you'll have the different variables that make up the system. And that's usually what people focus on when they manage natural resources. But resilience thinking tells us that it's the relationships between these variables that's just as important, if not more so. And so building up a picture of these relationships is part of the process of resilience thinking. So systems seems like a bit of an artificial word for something, but all we mean by a system is something that you can identify as something. So for instance, let's talk about a forest system. A forest system has a group of variables such as the different types of tree species, the understory, the climatic conditions that happen in that system, and they all relate to each other in a very definite, identifiable sort of way. And then if you contrast that, you could have a grassland system. It's a totally different set of variables and species and geologies, all these different things that make up the different components of a system. And then you could also think about the land uses. Maybe that grassland is used for grazing, and it's managed by certain regulations, and all of those things together can then be incorporated in how we think about that system. So one of the things we know about systems is that they are inherently stable. Otherwise, the Earth and the way our systems operate would have crumbled and disappeared a long time ago. And it takes a lot of disturbance to actually make a system become unstable and change the way it operates completely. And one of the things that is absolutely critical to keeping a stable system is this thing called a feedback loop. And so when we look at our system here, one of the things that we can identify is feedback loops within it. And here we have in our system the variables that relate to each other in the system, and then we also have the relationships between the variables with the grey colour. And you can see here in this particular part of the system is a variable that relates or affects another variable, and which in turn also affects the original variable. And this loop is what we call a feedback loop. And here, when we look at the system, we can have see a three-way feedback loop. This variable affects this variable, which in turn affects this variable, and once again causes a feedback loop between three variables. So not only are these feedback loops something that keeps the system incredibly stable, but if we upset these feedback loops or disrupt them, this is the critical relationship which can cause a system to destabilise and lose its identity and stop being itself, so to speak. So it's this transition from one identifiable system that we've co-evolved with to a completely different system, which has potentially catastrophic consequences for us as human populations and of course for other parts of the system. And what happens when you get this completely different new type of relationships that happen is we'll get an alternate state which doesn't look anything like the original system. Not only are the variables completely different within the system, but also the relationships between the variables are incredibly different within the system. And because we haven't evolved to learn how to live with this new system, we have to learn from scratch how to extract resources from it, how to live within it comfortably, and how to survive.